I'm a little confused as to why, to be totally honest, the Conservatives haven't started to address their misogyny problem, because I thought that would be like, that's clearly, if you look at the polls, you look at the numbers, that's where you are bleeding support, and it's not getting any better, right? Like the whole like biological clocks tour is just not resonating with half the population. What a surprise! But
I'm
like,
so shocked. I heard him say biological clocks. I was like, oh, there we go. I'm so glad someone's finally talking about this. The alarm keeps going off in my belly, and I'm really confused by it. I think I need to see a doctor, but I can't in this country. So
yeah, because we live in communism.
Hello, I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. Welcome to Bubble Pop, a weekly show where we break down the biggest headlines so you don't have to doom scroll. Then we'll dig deeper into something juicy that you should know about. In this episode, we've got Métis comedian, entertainer, and Twitch icon Lance from the Serfs. He hosts the biggest Canadian political Twitch stream, so we're going to talk about content creators and the federal election. And we'll dig into what's being said and not said about Indigenous rights on the campaign trail. But first, the news. By the time you're listening to this, there will be just over a week left until Canadians head to the polls. We've had 2 debates, although unfortunately, because I record this stuff on Thursday, only one has happened by the time I had to film this, so I'm sorry if something juicy happened in the second one. But so far, the Greens got the boot, Carney emerged relatively unscathed, Singh got in some good digs, and Poilievre toned down his pit bull nature. Though again, that's all from the French debate, so TBD on the English one. There were also some big announcements this week, some fiery conservative infighting, and we got confirmation that despite his silence, Trump does still want Canada to be the 51st state. Oh, and I had a little scoop this week that ended in action too. Let's dive in. First things first, we have to check in on the election campaign. The big news this week was that it was debate week. But as I'm filming this, we're already through the first of 2 debates, and it doesn't seem like anything major has happened that would significantly move the needle. Carney survived the French debate relatively unscathed as Poilievre dialed back his attack dog nature, although Singh had a moment where he pushed Carney on Israel's genocide in Gaza, pressing him to acknowledge what a UN Special Committee and Amnesty International have both already said, that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. But Carney responded by saying he won't politicize the issue. Here's that exchange.
It's heartbreaking to see innocent people being killed. Mr. Carney, why don't you call things as they are? This is a genocide. People in Israel do deserve peace and security, but people in Palestine do as well. What is going on right now is a genocide against people in Palestine.
You can conclude.
Why won't you admit it?
The situation in Gaza, in the Middle East, is horrible. But
It's a genocide.
But I never use that word in a political way to politicize the situation.
All right.
But it's a matter of facts.
That was Mr. Carney's response.
Meanwhile, we got to watch 4 male leaders talk about women's rights, so that was a thing that happened. But by and large, despite everyone's efforts to get a ding in Mark Carney's armor, given he's the front runner, again, nothing really happened that seemed like it's going to move the needle. Which makes me think that the English language debate isn't going to do too much damage either. But by the time you watch or listen to this podcast, you'll already know. So maybe I am currently eating my words. Honestly, though, the thing that really stood out to me during the debate night, beyond the Leader Debate Commission's very awkward handling of the decision to boot the Green Party, which technically didn't meet the requirements to participate because they didn't have enough candidates officially nominated, although they did have them endorsed at the time that the deadline laid out in the Leaders Debates Commission paperwork states. But the commission would have known that the Greens didn't have enough candidates like well over a week ago. So why did they wait until Wednesday morning to tell them? But the real screw up was the commission's handling of the media. See, the commission only allows 1 reporter from each news organization to participate in the post-debate scrums. But Rebel News kicked and screamed and threatened to sue the commission, so they turned around and allowed Rebel News to send 5 of its personalities into the post-debate scrums. I say personalities because a court has already ruled that Rebel News doesn't qualify as a Canadian journalism organization. Despite Despite this, Rebel News and other far-right misinformation spewing outlets dominated the questions in the post-debate scrums. These losers used this time to ask gross transphobic questions, engage in residential school denial, and generally just spew self-involved trash about their own persecution. On top of that, 2 people Mark Carney was forced to take a question and a follow-up from, so 4 questions in total, were directly tied to a hit piece on Mark Carney's non-binary child and the health care that child received when they were a minor. That's right, the founder of the outlet that published that piece and one of the dudes who co-wrote it both got to ask Mark Carney a question and a follow-up. Although I will also say I really wish Mark Carney had been better prepared for answering bad faith questions about trans rights. Because saying there are only 2 sexes when intersex people exist is not it. But it's also illustrative of a much bigger problem that these institutions face these days. Because of their fear of being labeled not neutral or biased, the bodies who label journalists and adjudicate access are increasingly complicit in the destruction of our information ecosystem. They need to meet the moment, and that requires growing a spine. Anyways, the debates were far from the only thing that happened this week, so let's talk about the other stuff. The leaders made several announcements this week that fleshed out their platforms. Though at the time I'm recording this, we still haven't seen fully costed versions of those platforms from any of the parties, so we don't know if the math behind those promises actually maths. But the leaders are promising that those costed platforms will drop soon, which is good because by the time you're listening to this, the advance polls are already open. But one announcement that caught a lot of people's attention this week was Pierre Poilievre's promise to become the first prime minister to invoke the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause is a clause in the charter that gives prime ministers and premiers the power to override certain sections of the charter. So override rights and freedoms for 5-year terms when passing legislation. And while its invocation has become increasingly popular at the provincial level, which is not good, it's never been used by a federal government. But Poilievre announced he would pop the clause's federal cherry by invoking it to overturn a Supreme Court ruling. Specifically one that found that a Harper-era policy allowing judges to hand out consecutive 25-year blocks of parole ineligibility in cases of multiple first-degree murders violated the charter and were, quote, intrinsically incompatible with human dignity. When asked if he'd be willing to invoke the clause in cases other than overturning that one Supreme Court decision, Poilievre said he's willing to use it to, quote, fight crime, which definitely isn't vague at all. In response, Carney called this announcement from Poilievre, quote, dangerous. Not because he wants multiple first-degree murderers to have an easier time getting out of prison, which, to be clear, isn't even happening now because the parole boards who make the decision when someone is up for parole of whether to grant it usually say no in those cases. But rather, he was concerned about the use of the notwithstanding clause. And to my delight, Carney's criticism prompted Poilievre to give us this absolute banger of a soundbite.
Yesterday, Mark Carney said it was dangerous to keep multiple murderers in jail for life. Mr. Carney, do you know what's dangerous? Murder is dangerous.
That's right, folks. Murder is dangerous, in case you didn't know. Meanwhile, there has also been some juicy conservative infighting this week. Doug Ford's campaign manager has been publicly talking smack about the federal conservative campaign, calling the way that they blew their massive lead in the polls, quote, campaign malpractice. But here's where the drama really heats up. While it's one thing for a behind-the-scenes guy, who is albeit quite powerful, to say this, Ford was then asked about his campaign manager's comments. And he said, quote, sometimes the truth hurts. Ouch. But despite what that comment has led some to speculate about, on Wednesday, Ford told reporters that he has no interest in taking over the helm of the federal Conservative Party if the result of all of this conservative on conservative violence is Poilievre getting the boot. And to that I say, sure. As we've been watching all of this drama unfold here at home, we also got another icky reminder of the ongoing threats to our sovereignty. Donald Trump in recent weeks has been awfully quiet about his desire to make Canada the 51st state. A little while back, Trump even called Mark Carney our prime minister and not our governor. So, progress. As a result of all of that, some people started to wonder, Has Trump changed his mind about all of that annexation stuff? Well, I've got bad news. The CBC's Katie Simpson asked the White House that very question, and they confirmed that Trump hasn't changed his position. He still wants Canada to be the 51st state. Not cool. The last thing I'd like to mention is a little bit of a scoop that I reported this week. Because as the result of a tip I received, I found a Canada connection to those horrifying mass deportations to El Salvador. As I'm sure you've already heard, Trump has been deporting innocent people who he claims are members of a Venezuelan gang to El Salvador. And both the Trump administration and El Salvador's president are refusing to send them home to their families. But as most Canadians watched this whole situation unfold in horror, it turns out that somebody with significant ties to Canada is a top dog at the company behind the planes that did those deportations. See, when I first reported this earlier in the week, Christopher W. Jamroz was a board director at Canada's largest museum, the Royal Ontario Museum. I say was because after I reported this story, I got an update from the ROM that he has now stepped down from their board of governors. But who is Jamroz and why should you care? According to his now deleted bio on the ROM website, he is a mentor to students from the Schulich School of Business out of York University. He co-chaired the Canada 150 Advisory Committee to oversee preparations to celebrate the country's 150th birthday. But when Jamroz isn't busy engaging in what the ROM described as his lifelong advocacy of education and, quote, promoting diversity and inclusion. He's also, according to one of his own bios, the, quote, executive chairman of the board of Global Crossing Airlines Group, Inc., a full-service passenger and cargo airline headquartered in Miami, Florida. What is this company, which is often just referred to as Global X, you might ask? Yeah, it's the ICE subcontractor that flew those 238 migrants to El Salvador so they could sit in a prison. Yeah. Very cool. So Canada, it looks like someone who has strong ties to our country, who mentors students at a Canadian university, who helped oversee preparations for our country's 150th birthday, and who was, until I reported on this, a board director at Canada's largest museum, is also a top dog at a company intimately involved with the horrifying mass deportations taking place in the United States. We have to keep shining a light on the things that people choose to do in this era of backsliding human rights and eroding democracy. Because we can't control when people choose to do awful things, but we can make sure that they have to publicly own those choices. That's the news for this week. After the break, we're chatting with Lance from the Serfs about the blurring lines between content creators and journalists, and the lack of discussion about Indigenous rights on the campaign trail. We'll be right back. In a world where right-wing grifters dominate the internet, here's something to brag about. Canada's biggest political show on the live streaming platform Twitch is unashamedly progressive. Lance from the Serfs is a Métis comedian and entertainer, and he does a great job keeping his followers up to date on the latest political news. It's a trend we're seeing more and more, and one that I'm arguably also a part of, albeit in a much smaller way. Lines are being blurred between content creators and journalists, and more Canadians are learning about the issues that matter from voices and in formats that you wouldn't typically hear or see on the 6 p.m. newscast. But is that a problem? I don't think so. At least, not when the facts are right. To talk about all of this, I am so stoked to welcome Lance from the Serfs on the show. Lance, welcome to Bubble Pop.
Thank you so much for having me. It's
Thank
an absolute
you for
honor.
coming on. Oh my God, the honor is all mine. Lance, more and more people are getting their news from folks like you, and to a lesser extent, a much lesser extent, me, on Twitch. Why do you think that is?
I was about to start with congratulations on all your success, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
I keep
That's
seeing
so
you blowing
nice.
up all over the place, but
I just post so much that no one can get away from me. That's really all I do.
that's clever.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. It's a shock doctrine.
Yeah, exactly. Learned it from
Why do I
Naomi
think
Klein.
that is?
Yeah.
I think honestly it's a combination of two things. I think it's a generational gap. Obviously, I think younger people are on devices and they don't buy paper and read newspapers and watch legacy media, which is why you see so much of like a lot of the mainstream like Fox News and stuff like that. Their demographics skew very old because that's a group of people who still use that as a form of entertainment. And I think also there's a pretty neat level of sophistication to the technology between, say, watching someone on a live Twitch stream or a TikTok video or something like that versus watching them on a TV where all you can do is yell at the TV and throw tomatoes. But I'm sure, as you know now, people can jump into your chat and communicate with you directly and try to influence the show in real time, which is kind of a neat feeling sensation you don't get in other media.
Yeah, and like they can ask questions, and I don't know, I find it really useful in that way. So if anyone listening isn't familiar with Twitch, could you just quickly explain maybe like roughly how it works?
Oh, totally. So Twitch used to be called, I think, Justin Streaming or Just TV. Yeah, Justin TV. Essentially, it's a streaming platform that was effectively started to stream video games, just to give people that parasocial relationship feeling of when you're at your best friend's house and he's playing Mario Kart or something like that. Why not do that in the digital space? And then that started to grow and grow until eventually it got acquired by Amazon. They turned it into Twitch, and there's obviously like alternatives to Twitch, but
scary alternatives.
Yeah,
of them.
Yeah. It's like we don't got to talk about Kick or anything like that, but I think at a certain point there was a number of people, for better or for worse. Some of them are just kind of horrifying individuals now, but there was a lot of people who started using a section of Twitch which is called Just Chatting to talk about things not just related to video games, talk about, say, politics or movies or fashion or stuff like that. And then that blew up until now. That's the most popular channel on Twitch. So as much as people want to say Twitch is a video game platform, why are people doing other stuff on there? It's really not. I mean, it is, yes, primarily focused on streaming video games, but you have all kinds of different content that is produced there now and live stream to their audiences.
This is kind of a massive question, but you mentioned that a lot of the demographic that watches mainstream or like traditional forms of media, I guess, like the 6 p.m. newscasts and stuff, tend to skew a bit older. But I'm wondering if there's anything else, like any other areas where you think that traditional media is kind of failing to adapt to this like new reality of how a lot of people consume their news and information. Where do you think traditional media is falling behind?
I think it's probably a two-part answer for me. The first one being that it is a good thing, and I got to give traditional media that they still have some pretty rigorous checks and balances for the most part. Not Rebel News, but for the most part. Yeah.
They're not considered journalists, though. A court ruled against them, which was really fun. Yeah.
But I think that whole thing is like very essential, which is why people like me, who are just jabronis who talk nonsense on the internet, right? I need to use legacy media because I need something that is actually sourced and cited and verified. And so for that reason, it is slower to have to actually hold yourself to account. There's a reason why Tim Pool can turn on like, an LED light and a camera and just spew the most vile nonsense that he wants because he doesn't have checks and balances. Yeah. And that's so in that sense, the online media space, I think, has an advantage over traditional in that it's fast, it's quick. It's why Twitter blew up in the first place. As soon as politicians and journalists started using it, there's a real-time way for you to you are in the room. Like, you actually get to be inside of the press corps or whatever as they're telling you that information. People are addicted to wanting and to knowing the most amount of information possible as quickly as they can. So I think in that sense, traditional media falls behind. But where I would criticize them heavily is traditional media is still preoccupied, and this probably has lots to do with the corporate structure. You know more about this than I do, and the sponsorships and the way that they basically operate. They are still stuck in, I would say, promoting an old paradigm of the world that I think most younger generations are waking up to is ultimately destructive and going to kill us all. Whatever you want to call that, neoliberal capitalism, or the fact that, there is an imperative for the West and imperial powers to align with countries that are doing genocide, whatever the case may be, right? I think that they are consistently regurgitating a lot of the same kind of like state talking points, or at least they don't want a lot of rebuttal from anyone left of center or anyone too far right of center right. Essentially, that's where they kind of position themselves, and I think because of that, it's a detriment to them for anyone who already understands how a lot of the stuff works to have to sit down and listen to someone kind of regurgitate, old school, like, neocon Bush era politics is a little tough.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that people tend to pick up on is the fact that, there are these baked in assumptions of what neutrality is, and it's not neutral. It is sort of, there is a perspective baked in there of what they consider to be normal or the baseline. And I think that a lot of people are kind of waking up to the idea that so-called objectivity is actually a bit of a fantasy, and it doesn't mean they're not doing good factual work, but it just means that I don't know, I just wish that we could have a little more honesty about those sorts of biases that exist in all of us. And if you acknowledge that and are transparent about that, then you can just focus on the facts, and people can contextualize any narrative-based choices that we all have to make to be able to literally communicate anything a little more
totally
effectively.
Agree with you.
Yeah,
I like total little piece of tea for you.
Ooh.
I have a lot of people who work in legacy media for like a variety of different big stations. I'm not going to name their names just to protect them, but I've had numerous people reach out to me asking, "Hey, can I come on your show? I love what you're doing. I want to blah, 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 reach more people." And I usually do this reciprocal thing, like, totally, I'll bring you on. Is there any chance you can speak to like their power panel to bring me on? Because it would be really good if I could bring my message to legacy. And 100% across the board, it's always like, oh no, we don't do that. And it's not because they're being dicks. It's because they're like, they will never tolerate someone who is like, left wing on that panel. They want a center to center right liberal, and then hopefully a not too far right winger. And that's the politics that they deal with.
Yeah. And, I think that like where it gets a little tricky is a lot of the extreme right, I find, leaves the realm of like the factual, whereas a lot of the more like hardcore lefties are just like extremely they're really into theory and like have some pretty like wild positions maybe, but like it's not as devoid of fact, so it's, I think that that's also like a difficult thing to navigate, because they feel like they can't have these more left folks on unless they have the more right folks on. But the right folks, if you're inviting on like Tim Pool, you're not necessarily going to have a factual input from that dude. So yeah. And, another thing I've noticed that leaders have started doing, like from the politicians and stuff, is they've started to dip their toes into the online content creator world, right? Like especially in the States, but in this election, we've seen like Polyev has done a few long form YouTube podcast interviews. He did Jordan Peterson before the election, and then did this like guy who I feel like is trying to be Joe Rogan or something. But anyways, and then Jagmeet Singh also invited a bunch of content creators onto his campaign bus, only to throw one of them under the bus, proverbially, when it came out that she had the audacity to talk about the dehumanization of Palestinian children. And the Green co-leader, Jonathan Pedno, did an interview with Steve Boots, who's a YouTuber and streamer. What do you think?
Fan.
Yeah, he's great. What do you think of this trend that we're seeing from politicians? Like, do you think it's something that's going to continue? And what do you view as like the positives and negatives of it?
I think it's 100% going to accelerate because I think the more people realize that it can be a useful tool, especially with you're seeing like, Hassan Abi in the United States going to Bernie Sanders rallies, having AOC on his stream a couple times. I actually was the person who was on that infamous Among Us stream with AOC.
Really?
and Jagmeet Singh. Yeah, as well as all those other famous streamers. Yeah, so I like that was a surreal moment, right? The whole thing was just kind of like it went by so quickly. But I think they're going to try and be doing that more and more. People need to realize the far right has been doing this already for a long time, whereas they have enormous podcast networks and alternative streams that you probably don't know about because most people aren't terminally online and following these really weird, like you are, obviously, I know, for a living.
Yeah,
but
the listeners probably aren't as online as you and me.
Yeah, I was like,
I hope not, for your sake.
I thought you were going to be like mansplain Diagolon to me, Lance, please. Like, teach me about Diagolon. No, I know you track this really well, but man, on the right, they have so many worlds of podcasts and streams and stuff like that when I discover some of these bubbles, I'm astonished at the viewership, right? Like, I don't think people realize sometimes how big their numbers are because, yes, hate sells, misogyny sells, racism sells, all this stuff is really popular. If you can find a corner on the internet to basically survive as an ecosystem long enough, but then you'll get all these smaller, like, MPs and MLAs who actually are on those podcasts, and it isn't until a major election cycle that it comes comes out, that's when you get all the clips. That's when you get all these people coming out, and it's like, hey, this guy's a straight up residential school denier, right? But like, he was on this podcast talking about eating bugs and all this kind of stuff. Or same thing happened over here with our BC conservative leaders. So I think the right have been utilizing this almost dangerously to a fault, because they're playing fast and loose with, like, you know, extremists and stuff like that. On the more mainstream, or at least the successful left-hand side, I'm not going to drop names, but I've had a ton of different political parties of different, you know, completely different parties themselves, right? Not just politicians, reach out to me asking, you know, can we get an interview? Can we go on the show or stuff like that? I think this is going to be a good thing. Granted, the people who are doing it, like, you know, including yourself, I've seen you have just wonderful interviews with Jagmeet Singh, right?
Thanks.
Is as long as you're, I think, focused on, like, you in that interview had no intention of changing your own personal beliefs, and it wasn't just like, here's a free press tour for you to say and deliver whatever message you want. And I think that's really important for especially leftist content creators. Is we are building this stuff on our own. We don't have legacy media. We don't have the Global News, the CTV, the Fox, all that kind of stuff, right? And the entrenched corporate parties do. And they have. So we also have to be very careful with how we use that. And I up in the past, bringing on people who, you know, I should have vetted more, kind of stuff like that. And you get better as you go on. But like that I think is going to be essential going forward, because we shouldn't take for granted the fact that, like, it's essential, I think, at this point, to have people who are willing to talk, like you just mentioned, you know, about the genocide of Palestinians. You won't get that on CBC.
No. Yeah. And that actually feeds perfectly into my next question. Before I go into that, I do want to say, I think you have made a really good point about it being a bit dangerous in some ways for politicians to go on these live streams and stuff, because sometimes they can fly a little too close to the sun. Like, I've even noticed sometimes when Polyev takes a question from Rebel News, which I think he assumes is going to be this, like, maybe easier ride or something, they sometimes ask something that I think they assume he'll be in line with, but it forces him to speak about issues that he's maybe been trying to avoid. Like, you know, one of the only times he's been asked directly about trans rights, it was coming from a bigoted place in the Rebel News question, but they were the ones who I believe asked him about, like, bathroom bans and stuff, and forced him to give an answer on where he stands on that issue. So it's like their intention might not be to hold these people to account, but they come from such a sometimes more extreme perspective that it can be a dangerous thing for the politicians. But no, the thing I wanted to ask you about was, like, I sometimes worry about politicians using podcasts and this online creator ecosystem to avoid tough questions. I think it's a bit less of an issue, as you said, with left-leaning streams, because the left is famous for eating its own. There's nothing that the left loves more than, you know, going after one of their own.
Yep.
But on the political right, things can get, like, really sycophantic. So how do we avoid that? Like, is it possible to avoid the content creator world being used as a tool to do some media and, like, look like you're talking to the public while largely avoiding accountability? Is there any way to get around that?
I think that people really need to vet the people that they and recognize that, what are you bringing them on for? Like, I think everybody who has a platform needs to realize the way you use and the stories you talk about matter. You have a megaphone, one that is a privilege that not a lot of other people have, and if you are shining light on an issue that is obviously very serious to you, and the way you craft that narrative is important. The same thing applies to politicians if you bring them on. Like, if you're bringing on a politician who you're in favor of some of their things, then by all means talk about that. But I would genuinely tell someone, like, I'm going to ask this. And if you're not comfortable with that, then, I don't want to have this interview, because ultimately I don't want to be on history having sat across from you, or even through a Zoom call, and knowing that I didn't actually ask this specific question at this moment in time, right? And to be honest, every single person I've ever worked with is like, oh yeah, fine, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay,
Or don't tell them and just ask it anyways. That's what I always do. Because then they can get ready for it. You don't want them to give you anything PR trained, you know?
Oh, well, that's true.
Yeah.
I see. Well, you're the journalist. Again, I'm just the jabroni on the internet.
You're an excellent jabroni, okay? Like, you're like the best jabroni out there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of your jabroni clout, obviously I'm talking to you on the eve of the debate. So we're doing this interview on Tuesday evening, which is, I know, tough because there's probably going to be a bunch of stuff to talk about by the time this is published and you guys are listening to this.
En français.
Yeah, exactly. En français, en anglais. We're going to know what happened at these debates. So you guys in the future already know. But Lance actually participated in a very special debate once. And so I wanted to ask him about it and get his, see if he has any advice or anything he'll be watching for from the leaders, because you debated Tim Pool, who is
I was like, where's she going with this?
Yeah, I'm sure you've debated other people too, but yeah, that was like one of the most notable things that I've seen. And Tim Pool, for those of you who don't know, is basically like a human thumb who was a unwitting beneficiary, unwitting of the whole Tenet media thing, where it turned out Russia was footing the bill for personalities to make content. Like, they say they didn't know Russia was footing the bill, but some of the influencers involved did. Tim Pool was not among them, according to what he says. So
didn't give the money back though.
Interesting, huh? Yeah.
Yeah, but they are the victims. Don't forget.
He is, yes, a very wealthy victim. So I guess I wanted to ask you, like, first of all, I'm just so curious, like, what was that like?
To be at the Tim Pool compound. Everyone's like, oh, the smell must have been crazy. I bet everybody in there was just like, carrying a gun and pointing it at you. And to be totally honest, his staff are all so kind, so friendly. It's like it's a little army of people. He's got a compound in the same way like you would find in Waco, Texas, kind of thing, where they are heavily armed. They have it in like a ridiculous. Oh yeah, they have a ridiculous amount of guns, but they're not literally carrying them. He just has gun rooms. He's preparing for some massive kind of civil war, like on some scale there. Like they have chickens, they have their own farming food, like they're getting ready for it, kind of stuff. So
I didn't even know that about. I thought that maybe it was just like in a room in like a normal house or something.
No, he's got a compound. It's like you have to get shuttled in there down a long driveway into like the compound kind of stuff.
Oh my God, there's so much money on the right. That is wild.
Yes, they had a fleet of Lexuses. Like I think they must have had like 7 or 8 Lexuses, and that was just the cars that he wants for people. I'm sure there's Cybertrucks now, but at the time, those were the cars that were like driving people around. I was like, this is obscene how much money this one YouTuber makes.
Yeah.
But it's one of those cases where the staff are the friendliest people in the world. They're all so kind, even if they're conspiracy minded. And then the only person who was a monster was Tim Pool. To be honest, even Moonlord was nice. Everyone was really kind.
And did you learn anything like in terms of I guess, I don't know, because debates are such a weird kind of human interaction, right? It's like, I feel like people aren't really going in trying to learn from each other. They're just trying to win. And obviously what you experienced was kind of one of the more extreme forms of that. We're going to see the politicians go after each other in that way. Was there anything that you learned from that experience about debating as like a skill?
Well, to be clear, I am not a master debater. I just really wanted to defend a lot of views that I find abhorrent, and why not? He's platforming me, just so we're clear, right? Like the guy gets, I think, like 50,000 live viewers. I'm lucky to crack 1,000 on average. So like he's 50 times larger in scale. So it was a platforming. But what shocked me, to be totally honest with you, is I have arguments in my head that makes sense to me that I figure I could tell someone who happens to be a bigot. Like, for example, I'm bi, and I was going to talk to them specifically about their views on gay people. And so I was starting by saying, I was like, but you don't think that being gay is a choice, because if that's true, then being straight is a choice. And like, what turned you straight? Or what I thought that would be enough, right? Yeah. And then they started going down this whole thing where like, if you are attracted to trans women, you're just by default gay. And then I was like, well, if I bring up examples of people who you consider to be attractive trans women, would you still consider, like, we were just going down this rabbit hole. Yeah. But I realized that they were more concerned with defending their principled beliefs than they were with any of it making sense. They eventually got to a point where they were willing to budge on maybe being straight can be taught and maybe being gay can be taught. I was like, really? Yeah, because then they were talking like, well, what happens in prison? Well, how do you explain that? Well, how do you explain prison? And then I was like, well, I think you're in a very small community of people who are all the same gender. I don't think that's the same thing as being able
like
to
they
be
get
converted.
hyper specific to try to like, I don't know.
I know.
Yeah.
Bring this stuff up. I know that's totally unrelated to what we're talking about.
No,
But
it's
that
not.
is...
It's not though, because that's sort of a debate tactic that they used. Was like
Right.
going extremely specific, having these like examples that aren't the average experience to try to skew things. Like that's definitely part of it.
Yeah, that part was weird. But in terms of like, if I compare that to the leadership debate, we all know what the leadership debates are going to be. It's going to be most Jagmeet and Pierre will team up against Carney because he's in the front runner. Jagmeet will probably get some really good sound bites against Pierre at some point because he's got a really good one saved in the pocket. Pierre will attack Carney the whole time and then occasionally attack, I think, Jagmeet specifically for wanting a pension, even though his pension is worth 3 times that.
Although he might not want to attack Jagmeet too much because he needs the NDP to come back because that's where the support is going like coalescing under the Liberals. So I'm curious to see because he has a lot of like tried and true attacks for Jagmeet that he could deploy for sure. But it's like it'll be interesting to see if he actually goes for it or if that's like a sign of how he's having to shift tactically.
I'm a little confused as to why, to be totally honest, the Conservatives haven't started to address their misogyny problem, because I thought that would be like, that's clearly, if you look at the polls, you look at the numbers, that's where you are bleeding support, and it's not getting any better, right? Like the whole like biological clocks tour is just not resonating with half the population. What a surprise! But
I'm
like,
so shocked. I heard him say biological clocks. I was like, oh, there we go. I'm glad someone's finally talking about this. The alarm keeps going off in my belly, and I'm really confused by it. I think I need to see a doctor, but I can't in this country. So
yeah, because we live in communism.
Yeah.
Well, then they put out that other ad though, right? They did the Andrew Scheer ad where he's basically treating the Liberals like a crazy ex-girlfriend. We're talking meth.
Yeah.
And then I was like, who's this for? Or the racing cars. I was like, again, who is this for? What demographic are you clinching right now by doing this whole like, I also love to drive very expensive fast cars,
Yeah.
I was like, okay, cool, bro.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually that's a good segue into the other thing I did really want to touch on, which is, you're talking about their issues with women, but also one thing that's been really, it hasn't been a huge conversation on the campaign trail has been Indigenous rights. And a lot of the times that Indigenous rights have come up in any capacity on the campaign trail, it's been in the context of like resource extraction or racist stuff being said about Indigenous people by a Conservative candidate.
Which kind of says it all right there.
Exactly. So I did want to ask you, like, as a prominent Indigenous political voice, what are your thoughts on the nature of this campaign and the things that are being said or not being said when it comes to Indigenous rights?
Yeah, I guess I should start by saying that I'm Métis, so we're by definition a combination of like the colonizer and the colonized, right? That's why I look so creamy white, as you can see before you. But on that issue, I've been a long time advocate for land back. I've been a long time advocate for speaking out against the residential school system, the horrors, atrocities, genocide, etc. Sorry, I don't have to make you bleep more words, so I'll
No,
just
it's okay.
I'll leave it there.
Those words are fine.
Oh,
it's
okay.
just the F word, really. That's the only one.
Okay. All right. Well, we're doing good on that, right? I haven't dropped it too many times.
You're good.
I think I would recommend everyone check out Pam Perlmutter's recent episode of The Breach. She talks a lot about how all the candidates have fared in terms of Indigenous rights. But I'm going to be honest, this election cycle is one of the most depressing I've seen for that topic, specifically because we are in a crisis of a national identity right now, which is combining with the fact that everyone's worried about Donald Trump taking over Canada. And so Canada and Canadians have suddenly become hyper-nationalistic in a very short amount of time. And like, I'm not saying in and of itself the idea of being proud to be a Canadian is evil, or that makes you a bad person, or the whole elbows up. I mean, come on, the Mike Myers stuff, I understand why they're doing it. It's all very cute, and it's Canadian wholesomeness that will really speak to a lot of normies and stuff like that. But that conversation immediately usually erases Indigenous land rights, and they usually get trampled in the process, which is really horrifying. And I've been trying to listen to a lot of people that I respect a lot, like Brandy Morin, for example. She's a journalist, and her and a lot of other Indigenous journalists have been trying to position themselves in such a way that, I agree with the overarching concept that if Trump takes over Canada, he is not going to be respecting Indigenous land rights. Trump is going to be turning it into the 51st state, and then that's going to be pretty much the end of that. And the fact that we've made a lot of progress, and when I say we, I mean like it's because Indigenous activists and people who have been fighting so long and so hard, as well as doing a lot of really important stuff through the courts, which is also incredibly important, right? That we have won a lot of victories. We have signed on to, UNDRIP. We have begun the process of, I live in Vancouver. The Squamish Nation over here just recently got one of the largest land back acquisitions of the most expensive property in Canada, and they've used it to build low-income housing towers immediately. That was one of the first things they did, right? So it's just like a beautiful success story there. They won a land back title, and they're using it to house people. Awesome. Like, can't say anything other than that's inspiring. So it does worry me. I what else sucks is the Mark Carney residential school stuff. Yeah. I don't think he really handled that well. I don't think anyone did. And on the other end, right-wingers cannot try and weaponize that when you've got Aaron Gunn, residential school denier, and you're standing behind him. That means you are officially making what he says part of what you consider to be acceptable behavior. And that's frankly abhorrent. So yeah, it's not been great.
Yeah, and I think on the Aaron Gunn issue, and Pierre Poilievre has been just like, he's been like a One Direction fan towards Harry Styles when it comes to Sir John A. Macdonald. Like, he's like every few days he talks about Sir John A. Macdonald, who was an architect of the residential school system, and he's like a vehement defender of Sir John A. Macdonald's legacy. And combine that with the Aaron Gunn stuff, with the talk about resource extraction and like building pipelines and speeding up permits, and the impact. They keep saying, we're still going to do effective consultation, but I'm seriously skeptical of that. I guess I wanted to ask you, like, do you feel like there's a backslide happening here? Because it felt like we were having some really good conversations about Canada's our history and present day, colonialist attitudes and the atrocities that have been committed against Indigenous folks here. And I guess I was just wondering, like, do you feel like there's a backslide happening here?
Yes. I don't think it started now, though. I think the backslide began during a couple years ago when a lot of the residential school graves started getting discovered. Yeah. And that led to the biggest backlash I've experienced in my personal career covering this stuff, which was the residential school denialism movement, which really was propagated by people like Lauren Southern and Keane Bexty, both of, previously of Ripple News, but I think Keane now does North something. He
does some other Juno News now with Candace Malcolm. They've collabed.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really
fun.
They made a really fun video, like walking in front of Parliament looking very serious, announcing their new collab. It's like a Substack, so super cool. Anyways.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That backlash wasn't just them. There's like a lot of journalists like Terry Glavin, stuff like that, but you could just see immediately this was something in which there was going to be a really easy angle for people to push back on if they happened to not want to believe the true history or the dark narratives of what took place, by going after something as simple as, well, where are the bodies? That's the one I get the most, and that's the one that's honestly, like, that one breaks my heart, because the initial Kamloops investigation started because of the discovery of a children's I believe rib cage or jawbone. It was a child bone that started this whole thing. So like that's what set this off. At this point, they have exhumed child-sized skeletons in Saskatchewan, for example. So if you literally are just some grim weirdo who needs to see kids' bodies, you have them now. So go enjoy the bodies. But I mean, outside of that, it's like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has the testimony of thousands and thousands of survivors. So I think in this day and age, to be actively engaging in genocide denial or propaganda is grotesque. And yet we have, candidates like Aaron Gunn who are actually completely, I guess, supported by the conservatives, despite how horrifying I find it. I would use that as a footnote to say, everyone go watch Sugarcane. If you haven't seen it already, go watch the documentary Sugarcane. It got nominated this year for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. It's the most powerful film I saw this year. No Other Land is incredible too. I'm not trying to take anything away from No Other Land. Also beautiful, amazing film. Go watch them both. But Sugarcane was just like, oh my Lord. Like, Good stuff.
Awesome. I haven't seen it, so I'm really excited now. I have something to.
You got to be in a. You got to
in
be
the
in
right
a.
headspace.
Yes.
Gotcha.
It's quite heavy. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like where I just made you take this conversation. So thank you for covering all that like very tough stuff.
Oh, no worries. Actually,
Yeah.
you know what? I can put a happier note on
Oh,
this.
yeah.
This is the only thing I will thank Russia for and Putin's administration is he effectively, I think, got rid of Lauren Southern and Lauren Chen.
Right, with
Yeah.
the tenant media stuff, like that.
Yeah,
really,
because
that was-
they're not posting
that's a tough
anymore. They have
look.
not. They have not posted since then. Lauren Southern is going on 7 months of no new videos and almost like 8 months, I think, of no Twitter posts or anything. So they are just like, mwah. Yeah.
Wow. I guess thank you, Putin. Never thought I'd say that.
I was
gonna
like,
get clipped.
that's 100%
That's the
getting
clip.
clipped. 100%, yeah, right there.
All right, Lance, I should probably start to wrap this up, but I did want to throw one last question at you, which is like, is there anything that you wish that more Canadians understood about the role that streamers like you play in the information ecosystem, or like anything that you just want them to know? It could also not be about that. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to say that you just have the platform right now?
Oh, fun. I'll use it to virtue signal about how incredibly noble I am and
Yeah,
say
perfect.
that these platforms are actually getting way more and better utilized by journalists in places like Gaza right now, who are
Yeah.
taking platforms like TikTok and uploading videos and uploading content that we would never see. We would not have seen or known anything that is happening if it were not for, again, like the hundreds of brave journalists who've been doing that. That is a revolutionary change between like when I was growing up, and the justification for the Iraq War was happening one day on the news, and then they were bombing Baghdad the next day, kind of thing. So this is one of those moments where it's like it's a lot harder to try and convince the general population to get on board with war crimes, atrocities, if they can see them, or if they can see young people who are capable of taking those stories, like a lot of incredible TikTokers do, and then actually explain them in ways that everyday people might not understand, whether that be tariffs, the economy, stuff like that. That's where a lot of people, and don't get me wrong, not all streamers, not all TikTokers, not all YouTubers are built the same. There are, again, an ecosystem, a healthy one on the right, where they are just spreading misinformation all day. I mean, you should tune into people like Rachel Gilmore, who do a good job of breaking them apart and exposing
Definitely.
their lives.
I hear she's great.
Yeah. I've heard nothing but good things. But,
Nothing ever. No one ever says anything bad about her.
I think, honestly, one of the funniest, was it you who responded to someone being like, Rachel's like the Taylor Lorenz of Canada, and then you're like, awesome.
Yeah, that was me.
I was like, okay.
I was like, that's a huge compliment. So thank you.
Yeah, she does really good work.
Yeah, she does.
Good for Taylor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, Lance, this has been a great conversation. I want you to pump your socials. Tell everyone where they can keep up with you, because they probably just really enjoyed listening to you and want to hear more. So tell them where they can do it.
You can find me everywhere social media is sold at the Serfs TV. That's the Serfs spelled like Lords and Serfs, not surfing. So at the Serfs TV for most things. And then our channel that does daily news is at the Surf Times on YouTube. And thank you to everyone who just helped us get past the 100,000 sub milestones. So
That's
I'm going to get a
awesome.
plaque.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
amazing. That's so exciting. Congrats. All right, Lance,
you.
thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bubble Pop. I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to Bubble Pop on Substack, Patreon, YouTube, or wherever you like to listen. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitch, and Blue Sky. I'd like to say a special thank you to Hans Vivian Wenzel for making the incredibly groovy music for Bubble Pop. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify under the artist name Hans. That's a lowercase h with an exclamation mark. Thanks again for spending this time with me. Doing this is a literal dream job, and I couldn't do any of it. I couldn't get scoops. I couldn't sit here talking to you without your support. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.